Hello and welcome to the Cuyamungue Institute, our Q&A Conversation for Exploration series. I'm Paul Robear, the Executive Director and President of the Institute, and along with my wife, Laura Lee, the Director of Research, Education, and Outreach, we want to thank you for joining us today. For those of you that are new to us, the Cuyamungue Institute is an independent, nonprofit research organization committed to researching consciousness in supporting the rediscovery of the ancient practice of ecstatic trance postures. And it was the insightful work of anthropologist Dr. Felicitas Goodman, the founder of this institute, who found the clues and revived the practice. She searched for the oldest evidence available, which she discovered in the world's collection of prehistory and indigenous art, and decoded these selected artifacts as ritual instructions. And as an educational institution, we recognize that to thrive, we need to take an open approach. So we're inviting scholars of parallel research and related fields to help broaden the scope of our own work and exploration. On these weekly Sunday discussions, we've included a full spectrum of topics from neuroscience, mysticism, trance states, anthropology, art history, archaeology, archaeoastronomy, shamanism, mythology, and more and more and more. We appreciate the fact that you're here. Visit our website at cuyamungeinstitute.com. All of our presentations are free, and as a nonprofit organization, of course, we invite you to become a supporting member, and we want to thank those of you that have become community members and continue to support the mission of the Cuyamungue Institute. Today, we're going to examine and discuss the role of the female shamans of Peru, the use of symbol, the feminine approach, the role of transformation of self in shamanic healing. And also our guest leads an initiative to find common ground among different faiths and spiritual paths, which dovetails perfectly to what we're doing here on these Sunday discussions, an opportunity to look at all the connecting points. So we look forward to hearing about that as well. And Laura, I'm going to let you do the full introduction because this is quite the introduction. When I did some research earlier today to prepare for today, I started looking up some of the articles by today's guest and looking at the papers. And I mean, you know, prolific art.
Work. Yeah.
So it's.
And Bonnie Glass-Coffin is our guest today. We're so excited to welcome her. She's a professor of cultural anthropology and religious studies and a shamanism scholar and bridge builder at Utah State University. Since 1975, she's been living off and on in Peru. She heard that call early on, and she's worked closely with the female shamans there to learn their healing practices and their spirituality. Her books on this are The Gift of Life, Female Spirituality and Healing in Northern Peru, and with Don Oscar Miro Quesada, the shaman whose life story she tells, in Lessons in Courage, Peruvian Shamanic Wisdom for Everyday Life. She's also an ordained interfaith and interspiritual minister, and she brings all this wisdom to all she teaches. The whole of one's whole being, both head and heart, she says, should be at the core of one's education, and addressing the biggest questions in a student's life, part of that experience. So Bonnie built an interfaith initiative on her campus and incorporated these diversity-affirming principles of anthropology into her classes. And Bonnie says, like so many of us, I want to see how the pieces braid together. And I think our common ground here is that and using inner sight to see beyond. Hello, Bonnie, and welcome.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for reaching out and inviting me. I just want to honor the invitation, honor each of you, the journey and the work that you've done, honor the late Felicitas Goodman. I want to honor all of my teachers along the way, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about them. And I want to honor this day, this place, this land. I'm sitting in a beautiful office at Utah State University in Logan, Utah, which historically belonged, if you can say belonged, sits on the land that was sacred to the Shoshone people of northern Utah, and I'm grateful to be able to stand in that place and to be able to move forward on this day with whatever spirit has in store for me. So here we are. Thank
Well,
you
let's
all.
start with your life journey. What led you on this path? It's been such an interesting and productive life, but what was the call to adventure that you heard early on?
Right. Well, like so many pieces of the human story and the human journey, I think things make a lot more sense looking backward than forward. And I can look backward now and say, oh, that's why that happened. That's why that happened. But in essence, I guess, love of anthropology, my love of shamanism, the sort of call to this work came as a high school student. I was a high school exchange student to Peru in 1975. And you asked if I had anything to show. I guess if I were to show something on screen, which I didn't prepare because all this came up very quickly, would be a picture of me as this little 18-year-old sitting, taking a family portrait with my sort of adoptive Peruvian family. I journeyed to a town called Trujillo in the northern part of Peru on the coast and lived there for 11 months with a beautiful family with 11 children and attended a Peruvian high school. Studied with Catholic nuns, and basically learned Spanish along the way and fell in love with the people and the culture, sort of had an immersive anthropological experience, right, early on, even before I knew what anthropology was. And also sort of found a calling to shamanism in that during the first part of my year in Peru, when I didn't speak much Spanish, my favorite person was the English teacher at the local high school who invited me to come with her on a trip around the country. And on the day that we left for our little journey, we passed a church and she sort of said, oh no, I forgot. I was going to order a mass for my grandmother. This is the anniversary of her death. And I said, as a good friend would. And by this point, I had sort of come to this understanding that this culture stuff is really just a veneer, that underneath that we're really all really quite the same, right? And I had this very heart-to-heart connection with this gal. Her name was Sonia. And so I said to her, oh, Sonia, I'm so sad to hear that. Tell me, what happened? What did she die of? And her immediate response was, well, she was killed by a witch. And I just went, what? Because I was just, in that moment, I realized that no, this culture thing isn't a veneer, right? There are very different life experiences that people have and that inform their walk. And so, of course, she told the story of her grandmother and how she had been basically bewitched by a sorcerer and how they had tried to use a shaman's healing techniques to heal her, and that hadn't worked. She eventually died. But in that one story, you were talking about storytelling a minute ago, and in that one story, my whole life opened up and changed. And I decided not only did I want to study shamanism, but I wanted to study whatever this thing was that I eventually learned was called anthropology. I wanted to find a way to get back. And so that sort of started me in the process. And looking back, that journey continued. I was introduced to the works of Carlos Castaneda between undergrad and grad school, and became just immediately enamored with this whole notion of altered states of consciousness and exploration of other, realms of existence. And as it turned out, I knew he was an anthropologist, but I didn't realize that I would end up in the same program where he had done his work, studying with his mentors, being part of Thursday night sessions with folks who had sat around the table with him, and telling my advisor eventually, I want to do the work that Carlos did. My advisor, his advisor, right? I want to do the work that Carlos did, but it's like it's all been done. But maybe what about women? Do you suppose I could do kind of a Carlos Castaneda type study with women? And so that was sort of how it all began.
What was the next step? How did you go and meet these female shamans? And you worked with a number of them in Peru.
I did. I did. Part of the next step was the introduction to that anthropology program. When I was going from having read Castaneda's books and really wanting to get to Peru to study shamanism, I called UCLA, which is where this program was, wanting to talk to the advisor. And the person who answered the phone, was a cold call. And the person who answered the phone said, "No, Dr. Wilbert isn't here today. I'm here. I'm his research assistant. Tell me about you." I said, "This is who I am. And I really know he's a shamanism scholar. I want to study shamanism." And his assistant said, "Oh, I just came back from a dissertation project studying shamanism." It's like, "Oh, that's fantastic. But I really want to go study shamanism in Peru because I really want to get back to Peru." And he said, "Oh, well, I was in Peru studying shamanism." I said, "Well, where in Peru? Because where I really want to go, where my heart is this town, you probably haven't heard of it, called Trujillo." And he says, "Oh, yeah, I was in Trujillo studying shamanism."
Oh,
I'm like, "Okay, I'm
The
kind of
fates
missing the
intervene.
program."
Yeah.
Exactly. Looking back, it all makes sense. Well, that was Don Gerolaman. Don Gerolaman is an anthropologist who has spent his career at Smith and at Smith College. And how I got to studying women shamans was, first, I worked with Don and with another colleague of ours, Doug Sharon, who had studied shamanism in Peru for years and years and years. And I was their research assistant on a project where they were studying the outcomes of these healing seances, these healing ceremonies with the patients of several male shamans. And so I got a chance to interview all these patients. And every time I went on an interview, I said, "So, by the way, do you happen to know any women who do this work?" And for about 9 months, the answer I got was no. Women don't do this kind of work. Women might be witches, but they're certainly not healers. They might, have pacts with the devil, but they're certainly not healers. So I'm getting a little bit of the folklore, right? Because then it all comes from a place. And my research assistant partner, there were two of us really tramping around the outskirts of Trujillo, finding all of these patients in their homes after these ceremonies. His name is Raphael. And about 9 months in, he said, I, I guess I could share with you. It's not something I talk about much, but my mom has worked extensively with a female shaman, so maybe I could arrange an introduction. And so that's how
Because
it
you
happened.
knew
But it
they were
was,
there.
yep,
Yeah.
yep. It wasn't easy because at the time women were very much, this is a patriarchal system, right? And even studies of shamanism are very male oriented and male dominated. So it took a lot to kind of get in, and but that's how it happened.
So we can get into why the patriarchy had to suppress women, and the patriarchy wasn't dominant in the indigenous cultures, were they? It was more equitable. It was a shared duty, men and women across the board in so many indigenous societies, and
Oh
so that
yeah,
just came in later. And of course, then the tales, oh, witches, let's just demonize that whole thing so you can't make it forbidden turf. We'll talk about
right.
that later. But when you finally met the women shamans, what did you find? Tell us about their healing practices. You mentioned the healing seances of the men, but what were the women doing when you finally got to meet
Right.
them? And good perseverance there.
Thank you. Good anthropologist, right?
Yeah.
I will not give up. Well, of course, that wasn't my question. My main research question was, does gender to make a difference? Does the gender of the healer make the difference in terms of how illness is conceptualized and therapy is structured? Does it matter? And that was a time in anthropology where people were just beginning to bring gender into the conversation. And I, over the course of the better part of 2 years, I mean, what I found was that for women who hadn't been trained by men, so I worked with 5 women eventually. And what I found was that for women who hadn't been trained by men, which is to say, 3 of the women, that healing was, first of all, gender did make a difference. Second, that healing was not about this vicarious, I will come to my, don't come to my altar, right? Come to my altar, sit, I will call in the directions, I will invoke the spirits, you just hang there, I will do the work, you will be healed, right? It wasn't a vicarious kind of, let me do your work. Instead, it was the way that healing works is you have to awaken to, first of all, your own inner spirit. You have to awaken to the soul within, and you have to do the work. And the work involves, coming into a deeper awareness and acceptance, first of all, in patriarchy of what is. You can't sit around playing the victim, right? Oh, if only this were different. Oh, if only, my husband didn't beat me, or if only this, if only that. You know, the foundation for healing comes first in accepting what is, and not, and turning towards that rather than away from it, not to resign oneself to it, but to use it as a basis for reclaiming a sense of the sacred within, right? So it was all about reclaiming a sense of the sacred within and doing the deep inner work of befriending the circumstances of one's, and lamenting, right, the circumstances of one's oppression, in order to be able to give voice to that, and to be able to reorient the narrative around remembering the sacred patterning that had been so stamped out in that patriarchal setting.
Beautiful description. Yeah. How would they go about doing that?
Right. The process, the ceremony looked very similar as it did for the men, right? There was opening of, first of all, I don't know how much your listeners know about shamanic ceremony in northern Peru. Do you want me to just briefly describe
I would
that?
say our audience is versed in many of these wide spectrum of practices, but we need to know about your specifics, of course. Yeah.
Okay, right. Well, as in traditional shamanic ceremonies in Peru, first of all, shamanism in Peru is really less explicitly about, kind of a spiritual awakening, right? Traditionally, it's less about a spiritual awakening and more about healing sorcery, right?
Oh, I see. Okay.
Right. So in that traditional context, for 1,500 years, but certainly for the last, I mean, we have representations in the ceramics of the use of the San Pedro cactus, the Echinopsis pachanoi, right? To be able to engage in a communion with the powers and forces of nature and with the holy, through the intercession of St. Peter, San Pedro, the one who holds the gates to the kingdom of
Ah,
heaven, who is this sacred medicine plant, this cactus that has the entheogenic qualities, is mescaline based. And through the ingestion of this cactus, people sort of open the doorways to perception, right? The healers and the patients who are engaged in this all-night ceremony. The ceremonies happen according to the blooming of the cactus, which is a night blooming cactus, throughout the course of an evening. So they begin around 9 p.m. in the evening, they end about 6 a.m. in the morning. Among many traditional healers, the understanding is that the cactus and the sacred objects, the artes on the altar that are imbued with power, during the calling in of these powers, that these objects cannot see daylight, right? So historically, these ceremonies happen at night, and there's a process, right? There's a creating of sacred space. There's a communing with there's a communing and a consecrating of the space, a calling in of the directions, a praying, a very syncretic, right? These are very Catholic people. And the people I was working with, I should clarify, we're not, we're not at all removed from the vicissitudes of Western civilization, of modernism, of patriarchy. These were people who were living on the edges of urbanity, of urbanization, and so very much steeped in a modern world, right? But through this first communing and gathering together with the entire community around the altar and praying together, and then ingesting the sacred medicine, and then waiting, right, for the spirit to make itself available while the healer is empowering the objects and calling in the spirit. And then when the spirit has arrived, the healer has a highly sensitive, it's very attuned to the messages that are coming through this cactus about both what the imbalance is that's caused the illness, and also what has to happen. And so the ritual process involves, specifically with the women I was involved with, a lot of what we might call audience participation, right? It's not a sitting on the side and just listening. It is, when any person is called before the altar and the healer recognizes that perhaps their soul has been lost and there's a need to restore the soul, everyone in the ceremonial space is called upon to ritualistically walk forward in symbolic ways, stamping their feet and waving bandanas and going in the context of the ritual space to the realms of consciousness, out to the river or the mountain or whatever place the healer has been able to affirm that soul is lying, and all collectively call in the soul with the bandanas, with the handkerchiefs, and call it in and bring it back and move across the ritual space and rub over the patient's body with these bandanas, calling in the soul. So there's a lot of participation, there's a lot of embodiment, right, in the ceremony.
Gestural language as well.
Right. Yeah. And then, the ceremony. So during the course of the night, each person who has brought their ailment is called up before the mesa, before the altar, and they have a turn, right? And the healer engages deeply with the spirit world, figuring out, what happened, what the cause was, who the spirit beings are that need to be appeased, how that can be transacted. There's rubbing with sacred staffs that happen, both to help clarify, bring the source of illness into a place where the healer can see it by sort of rubbing the scales, rubbing the layers off so that the impression is more available on the external part of the patient's body. And then also that cleansing is a way of using that spirit power that comes into these objects on the mesa to invoke healing. Sometimes after the fact, there are prayers. Sometimes there's plant medicines, teas, baths, ritual baths, flower baths. And often, especially with the women, there's this piece of sort of spiritual counseling that occurs, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So, hey, here's what's going on, and here's the part that you need to get right with, right? So there's an invitation to participation on a soul level, on a mental level, on a spoken level, on an embodied level, on a physical level.
And you interviewed many of these patients, both for the men's healings and the female shaman healings. What were the patients saying afterwards that you interviewed? And how did they differ between, you said gender does make a difference.
Yeah. So I think the stories were very individual, as you might imagine. And the I would say that about 2/3 of the patients that were interviewed after the fact, right, as part of this other project I was working on, expressed sort of a deep sort of transformation, right, a healing. They didn't always, and often the conversation was about a change in physical pain, right? Heard lots of stories of I couldn't walk when I went to the healing circle and now I can walk, right? Or in this context, healing in illness is not just about the somatic, it's not just about the physical, but it's also, of course, about the psychological, the relational, the economic, right? So sometimes people had gone to the healer because their businesses were faltering. And so maybe the response was, well, people are starting to come back to my business again. Or if they'd had physical pain, I don't have the pain in my side anymore. Or if it was relational, I'm getting along better with my mother-in-law than I was, right? So the stories were very individual and
as were the complaints. Yeah.
As were the complaints. Yeah.
From the female shamans who were taught by men versus the female shamans taught by women, how did that differ?
Yeah, the female shamans who were taught by men, there seemed to be, at least in the ceremonies that I witnessed and in the interviews and that I later did with them, more kind of a, healing for rather than healing with.
Like you mentioned.
Kind of approach. Yeah. It seemed less about counseling, less about how stop being a victim, right? And people had different kind of needs, right? And this is something that I've learned in chaplaincy, which is, as I was mentioning before we came on, that my latest incarnation is as a board certified chaplain, right? And a story catcher of people in hospital settings. And people in hospital settings are engaging with their illnesses in similar ways to what I found in the shamanic world. Some are, blaming everybody but themselves, right? Oh, this world has done me wrong. And in the response to that, and I found this with my female healers that I worked with, was kind of a truth telling. The universe does not owe you anything, right?
Yeah.
So let's talk about why you feel like you have to be such a victim. Is there another choice that you could make where, or maybe it's somebody who has really a need to remember their sacred worth, right? And so in that case, maybe the counseling is more about, you are holy, you do matter, you are worthy, right? So the counseling that I heard with these women, which was really focused on helping people come to terms with what needed to change in their lives in order to reclaim that sense of connection and purpose and meaning. And sometimes what's the word I'm looking for? Atonement, right? Sometimes there was a need to,
What do you see as the healing mechanism? Some placebo effect, certainly. Some self-empowerment, some self-knowledge that they're giving. What role do you think the spirits had, or what was called upon? How do you explain the healing that happened in terms of the mechanics of it?
Yeah. Well, I guess I would call upon the wisdom of one of the teachers, one of my more recent teachers, Don Oscar Miro Quesada, to speak to that. And I believe in the ceremonies that I've witnessed with him and the healings that I've witnessed with him, it's kind of a two-part thing. One is raising the vibration in the ceremonial space, right? By affirming the sacred reciprocity, what we call in Quechua the Aini, right? The sacred reciprocity between the human walk and the spirit walk, by acknowledging and offering the awareness and inviting the spiritual powers in to do their work, right? So that's one piece of it. And then the second piece is the holding of the intention, right? Of the seeing the bereaved or the sufferer, whatever it is, seeing them as inherently whole, seeing past the wounding, seeing the implicit wholeness, and allowing for, I guess the transformation is about setting that space where the person who is receiving the healing can open to the awareness of the open to the awareness of the deep and complete connection with all that is, right? Dropping the veils such that they can reclaim that wholeness from a deep place of awareness, that connection is implicit and that separation is just an illusion. So it's a combination of opening to the power of the spirits and also dropping the veils of illusion, I would say. And the role of the healer is to provide the template and the ritual that opens that space of acknowledgement. I know I'm babbling because it's mystical, right?
It's mystical.
It's mystical.
And it has a direct impact on our psychology, on our physiology, on our whole being. And so, yeah, it's multi-pronged, isn't it? Yeah. So, what wisdom would you bring back to the West from your your adventures there, your insights there, your work there? And then tell us about the gentleman that you wrote your second book about.
Yeah. Well, the wisdom, that's a little small question, right? I mean, that's nothing big. I think one of the deepest teachings of the women that I worked with, in fact, I think it resonates through all of my work, is opening in order to bring healing back to the world. What we need to do is to restore right relationship, right? We need to restore right relationship with the world of spirits, acknowledging the gifts of every day, acknowledging the gifts of food and of gravity and of air and of sun and of rain, acknowledging the gifts in a way that we are actually looking at, as Martin Buber once said, our relationships as I-thou relationships rather than I-it relationships, right? We are deeply in relationship with the material world. And so in order to come back into right relationship first, I think, I forget which mystic it was who said, if the only prayer that you ever offer is thank you, that's enough, right? recognizing the power of gratitude, and that right relationship is founded in an awareness of gratitude first, right? And that right relationship involves, of course, being willing to come into right relationship with yourself first,
Yeah.
right? And especially with women, right? It's you talked a minute ago about the hero's journey a little bit, and going out on the adventures and learning out there and then bringing it back. And I would say that one of the lessons, at least with these women, is that the journey is really not so much an out and back as it is a journey inward.
Mm-hmm.
The journey inward to the deepest parts of the self, to be able to acknowledge and integrate, as Jung and so many others have told us, to be able to deeply integrate and acknowledge, the shadow self, the shame, the guilt, the anger, the rest of it, to be able to engage with all of those parts of ourself. What I'm saying is to be vulnerable first, right? Because in order to engage in right relationships with others, this is something I've learned in chaplaincy, you have to be willing to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to engage in right relationship with yourself first. And connecting with others means first, where am I? Who am I?
Mm-hmm.
Right? What do I need to learn from this relationship? The second thing that I would say is listening, right? I think that, we say this so much that it becomes trite and it becomes just a cliche, but really so many of the ills of our world today would be healed with just deep listening. I'm thinking of the Jewish tradition of the Shema, right? That the I don't know if I say that correctly, but the acknowledgement at the beginning and the end of every day that the invoking of God, the one, the eternal, right? And the first two words of that are listen, Israel, listen, right? So I think that one of the messages is listen. And that is a little bit of the braid of the thread that I bring, is to spend my entire life trying to learn how to be a better listener, right? And to walk with rather than teach at.
Right.
And I think that's one of the deep lessons of the work with these female shamans, as well as with the other pieces of my walk that I'm still struggling with, because of course I'm a teacher. Of course I like to counsel. Of course I like to point fingers and say, oh, well, you need to learn X, Y, and Z. But in the moments where true connection occurs is where I can listen and walk with and express compassion, shared suffering, rather than talk at.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the balance between the male and female we see, where the male sometimes has that generally wanting to just provide the answer, the direction, the instruction, rather than that empathetic approach of feeling, listening, connecting, that more feminine way of approaching.
Oh, the top of the pyramid versus the circle, too.
Right.
So it's interesting to me that the same lessons that you're describing for us as individuals in the journey to healing and balance, the life journey, you find in shamanism, in your work. We certainly find that in our work. It's an ongoing process. It's a work in process. It's little lessons at a time. It's self-illumination. It's the grace of the spirits coming in to illuminate the path. It's the compassion and the safety net and the safe container, the acceptance, that solace that's offered to get the work done. Right. To see the insights. And people have leveled this criticism at us to say you can't go backward, and that they weren't perfect. No indigenous society was perfect. And it's really not the point. It's that a society that engages in this wholeheartedly, the society that allows this, that permits this, the society that sees beyond the linear, the rational thinking, the top-down dynamics, right, that is intriguing to us. And I do want to acknowledge the whole Western self-help movement for rediscovering these in a secular right fashion, for employing the same techniques. They work. And also the openness of society now that we can talk about our work, and that you see psilocybin being used in a clinical process with deep counseling. It's similar to what you're describing with the San Pedro, that we're
Right.
learning the old ways and that they work and we're employing them again today. I find a lot of hope in that. And to ask you about your anthropologist eyes, looking at our current society, where are
Right.
we and how did we get so far off base? How did the patriarchy gain ground to suppress women for so many millennia? What was it?
That's a lot
Right.
of questions.
Yeah. Yeah. What's
Right.
the
Yeah.
healing about? What, you know?
Yeah, an easy question again.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'm just noticing there's a couple of questions in the chat, and maybe the
Oh,
first one,
yeah.
I noticed that Sharon Rose, asked, do the women shamans talk about goddesses or female faces of divinity, or does this urban or Western divinity system prevail? And I think that that's a really prescient question because it goes exactly, or my answer will sort of relate to this question about, so where did this male patriarchy come from anyway,
Yeah.
right?
Come on. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a theologian, but I mean, we could go back to the desert mothers and fathers, and we could go back to like the early patriarchs and in the first several hundred years of the Christian church anyway. But I don't think Christianity has the only
Didn't corner the market on
the corner on the
patriarchy.
market on
Yeah.
patriarchy. Absolutely. Listen to Marianne Williamson at her speech at the Parliament of the World's Religions in Salt Lake City, and I'm sure some of her speeches since then. It's like, no, all major religious traditions have put their thumb on women. Thank you. Right. But no, I mean, there is something about this separation of the material and spiritual worlds, the world of material, the world of matter, the world of spirit, right? That seems to be, I think, part of the problem. I
Mhm.
think a big part of the problem. And in patriarchal spirituality, I would say, and there is this sort of, it goes back to what I was saying just a minute ago. There is this quest to go beyond the body, right? This quest to leave the imperfect, mortal, sexual, erotic vessel behind, to go beyond the body, to be spirit only, right? Which obviously left women out of the picture for
Yeah.
lots of reasons. Because if you're a woman seeking a spiritual path with 3 kids to feed or 10 kids to feed and a husband and guardians to tend and the rest of it, excuse me, you don't have time to take 20 years off and go to a monastery, right? So it's like you have to be able to see, and our indigenous wise women say this frequently. I think about the grandmothers, right? The 13 grandmothers, and the messages that it is in this life, it is in this world, it is in the doing the dishes, it is in the
Yeah.
wiping the baby's bottom, right?
Hmm.
That the place of spiritual sacrality, sacredness happens.
Yeah.
And until we are in a place where we are willing to acknowledge or to re-acknowledge the power and the importance of the material foundation of our human existence, and to give it sacred status, right?
Yeah.
To come into right relationship with it, right? As one of your listeners asked, what about Pachamama? Yeah, absolutely. Pachamama, Earth Mother, Mother Earth,
Mhm.
is foundational in women's spirituality, because it is about reclaiming the sacredness of the lived body, embodied experience. What Felicitas Goodman, right? It's about the movement
Yeah.
in this world. It's about the embodiment. It's not about the headspace, right?
Body postures,
Right.
yeah.
It's about the body postures. So
Yeah.
that's a piece of it. And as long as we have, I mean, I love writings by people like Father Richard Rohr and Matthew Fox, and
Mm.
some of the other, and Thomas More, and some of the other great wisdom people who have sought to reclaim a creation-based spirituality, right, rather than an original sin spirituality.
Well, then
You
this
know,
brings
let's
up a point that the ecstatic experience can be very orgasmic, right? You can liken it. You can say this is orgasm of the universe, of the body, of the brain, not just the genitals. It just feels that uplift of life force that takes you away, that ecstatic state. And so, I mean, that's built into us, right? That is built into us. And if you take sex and marriage away, because I'm sorry, but that's how humans get here on Earth, is through the portal of the womb and the birthing process. Then if you make that wrong and forbidden, then, I mean, where are you? Women suddenly now, we have no place, right?
Right.
So, but why not?
Virgin Mary, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
How do we, which, I mean, there's so much paradox, isn't there, in most spirituality, but
yeah.
that
Leave the body behind. What are you left with? Yeah, spirit. Why about the two together? This balance of the two together.
Right.
Isn't that the full spectrum? Yeah.
Right. And I think that really is a core of feminine and feminist spirituality. I mean, so many thinkers and writers in so many different traditions have talked about, and in my first book, I talked about not transcendence and actually not immanence either, although it's both, right? Like I'm noticing
Let's go to gallery view, because let's engage some of these comments.
I'm noticing, it's Miriam Weinstein who says there's no goal of transcendence in Judaism. Well, it's both and, right? It's the immanence and it's the within and the beyond. And what I talked about in my book, which was an archaeological principle that Linda Scheel, who was a wonderful Mayan epigrapher, right, talked about coessence, right? This idea of it's the both and, the immanent and the transcendent, the bringing together of the body and spirit, right? The within and the without, that is at the core of this reconciled spirituality that I think is so feminine and feminist and often mother oriented in the way that we think about it.
Well, and also eco-spirituality. Let's engage our entire planet. Let's engage the entire web of life. Let's engage life force all over the universe. You talk about non-human consciousness. No wonder you're about interspirituality, because if you really want to throw open the spectrum, let's include the spirits or whatever that intelligence of the universe is, that life force out there is.
Right.
I mean, if we truly want to widen the spectrum. Your thoughts on that? And then let's take some comments and just Paul's in charge of that. I believe Paul's in charge of that. So.
Okay. Well, again, not a small topic, right? But the awareness of the intelligence, of the sentience of those who don't just walk on two legs, right? It has been instrumental in terms of my life in the last 15 years. It has changed everything, right? And it's what I've written about. Actually, I wrote the one article that Chris was mentioning that I wrote. I had a wonderful opportunity to be. Edie Turner was such a light and a wonderful spirit and a good friend in my life. And I remember, giving a presentation of this paper where I talked about my first encounter with sort of non-human consciousness, and she talked about me as the Longfellow of anthropology, and I was just like, oh God, Edie, you are so what a gift, right? But anyway, somebody in her own right who talks so much about ontological themes in anthropology, and it's, come on, people, we say that the work that we do is about taking seriously what people tell us about their spiritual paths, and then we just relativize it and say, oh, well, what they really mean is X. But no,
let's reinterpret them according to Western worldview. Right. But Edith Turner did such a marvelous job of saying, I'm sitting there at the African ceremony and I'm seeing the spirits. Yes. They come visible to my eyes, and taking it seriously. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
appreciate
that was
her.
one of my own moments too, that really changed everything was it, in ceremony with with Oscar Miro Quesada, who I studied with for about 7 years, and we eventually wrote this book together. Um, but it was this moment where I had this encounter with non-human consciousness that changed everything and that I've written about. And I'd love to just share that little story if you would be
Please, please.
okay.
And then you mentioned Chris. We need to go to Chris as well, Van Poel. We need to take some other comments, but yes.
Yeah, yeah. Um, okay. So, try and be brief with this. I had been a scholar of shamanism for a very long time. Never really, as much as I look back and say, wow, I really did learn a lot. I really didn't ever work with these women as an apprentice as much as I did as an anthropologist and as a student and as a as a patient, quite literally.
Mhm.
Uh, and so it was very humbling when my first teacher, Isabel, told me that I was sicker than most of our other patients and that she'd be willing to work with me, but I'd better recognize that I really needed the help. So very different than the apprentice anthropologist, right? But at any rate, I had a very kind of intellectual relationship as much as I was yearning and seeking until I met Oscar. And and he invited me, it's a long story, I'll make it short, but he invited me to come
We have
to
time. Go
his
ahead.
well, he invited me. So he's this Peruvian American healer who actually his first experiences with the healing tradition in Peru were very similar to mine. He worked on the North Coast. He worked with male healers. He was there about 10 years before I was. He's about that much older than me. No, actually not. He's about 6 years older than me. But he was a swaggering young Peruvian buck who basically got his ass handed to him by the first shamanic healer he visited, who basically said to him, man, you are really sick, you need help. And he stayed an apprentice with this man. Anyway, I had never heard of Oscar until 2005. He actually invited me to come to speak at a gathering of his. He was a practitioner. He took a different route. He didn't go the scholar route. He went the practitioner route after apprenticing. And he'd invited me as somebody who knew something about female spirituality to come speak at this gathering of his. And I was very taken and I was very enamored with the gathering and very honored when about 6 months later he invited me to come to his house and sit with him, which, I mean, he's a pretty recognized dude. It's like, wow, I get a personal invitation to his house. And at the time I was thinking about a sabbatical project where I was wanting to ask the question about transformation, right? How have these ancient practices transformed to serve the modern world, as you said a few minutes ago, Laura? How have the lives of those touched by his work been transformed? How was he transformed? And maybe how can the discipline of anthropology transform in some way through a deeper experiential kind of work with shamanic healers? So I went to his house and I took my little sabbatical questions with me and I told him about my project and how I wanted to study transformation on all these levels. And he just looked at me with these very steady, clear eyes. And he said, of course, I'm happy to be part of your ethnographic project. But first, tell me, are you willing to be transformed?
Key question.
Yeah. So I was like, oh, okay. And so we spent 3 or 4 days together and we engaged in ceremony with plant medicine. And I had a different experience than I'd ever had before. And I'll just read what happened. So during the course of that ceremony, in a particularly clear-headed moment, I'd walked outdoors and sat in silence. There beneath a waning gibbous moon on a cool Florida winter night, the scene before me was completely ordinary, except that every plant, from the tallest coconut palm to the smallest blade of grass, acknowledged and honored my presence. like a crowd of well-wishers at an acceptance speech, all turned towards me in unison when I appeared, bowing in a sign of respect. When I returned the nod, the gesture was repeated. When I looked away, the undulations of stem and flower and bark and frond became less focused, marked by private conversations and shared whispers between those plants in closest proximity to one another. But when I returned my gaze again, the coordinated movements were repeated, bowing and swaying like schools of fish or flocks of geese on a common flyway. The multitudes repeatedly bowed, and I reciprocated. We were equals, honoring one another. As this polite greeting continued, I suddenly realized viscerally what I'd been writing about for many years, that all life is co-created, as willing humans interact in reverence with the very ground of being that sustains us. This co-creation is reflected and nourished by the ways in which we interact with one another, by the ways in which we care for the material world that provides for us, and by the ways in which we relate to a firmament with which both inspires and humbles us as we journey. Quite literally and quite simply, I learned that night that as you sow, so shall ye reap. So that's the experience with non-human consciousness. Like every blade of grass was just alive and acknowledging my presence. And that changed everything as I bowed back.
Yep. And we have that in ecstatic trance postures as well. I mean, it's so available in so many different avenues. I think the universe is redundant, creates so many portals, really wants us to be there in that space. And I sometimes think that all of the rest of creation is in that space, but for us. We're the ones that fell out of grace. And it's our struggle to get back, our continual struggle to open our eyes again and reconnect. I don't know. But I'm fascinated by I'm fascinated by the history of avenues to get there, and then why the disconnect, why suddenly that was forbidden turf, why only mystics and sages can go there and the common people cannot in our society. And so, but one thing I do celebrate is, thankfully in our free society today, so much is available and we can all find our way back. It's available if you choose to pursue it. You can find your way back. So we have another guest who wrote about the various ways and methods of ritual and ceremony to do so. And he said the prophecy was that when all of this now becomes readily available, nobody will care. So I think that's kind of surmises the most of our society today. I noticed that your second book, you talk about Pachacuti and a prophecy. Could you explain that one, please?
Yeah. So, and I'm getting feedback. Are you guys getting feedback, or is it just me?
We're not.
I'm not hearing that.
Okay.
Look to the chat room. Is anybody?
Yes, I'm getting a lot of feedback.
Oh, really? Okay.
Okay. So
I think it's when you come up on your computer close. If you're further back, it's not as bad. Like yes, when they're.
does it mean I'm like this?
I'm at Bonnie. Yeah, her
Me.
feedback.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm still hearing a lot of it. Is that better on your end?
Yeah, a little bit. Yes.
Okay.
I'm not hearing it. So
It's weird because we're not hearing it.
yeah. Thank you, Chris, for alerting us. Yeah.
I'm wondering if I suddenly it left. I'm not getting feedback anymore. So
Oh, good.
hopefully that helped. So Pachacuti. Yeah, the Pachacuti is a Quechua term, right? That means Pacha. Pacha is a very complex term. Pacha means earth, as in Pachamama, as in Earth Mother, right? But it also means epic. It also means era. It also means yuga, right? It's like the time, the epic, it also means place. So it means time and place, right? And it is a sort of, it's also state of consciousness, right? Pacha is all of those things sort of encoded in this lovely Quechua term that directly relates to the mother, right? But Pacha Kuti is a turning over, right? Kuti is a making the dark light, making the invisible visible. It's a turning over of the soil. So Pachacuti is a turning over of the state of consciousness in which we find ourselves, right? It is a coming back into relationship. It's related to another term called the Taripai Pacha, which is about the age. We are in the age of re-encounter. We are in the age, the prophecies say, of re-encounter, of coming back into sacred relationship with ourselves, of remembering, of remembering that our wholeness, our connection, right?
Yeah.
And that is where we're at. But of course, to come into that place, Pachacuti is also a time of great disruption. You know, you don't turn over the whole world without there being some pain and agony, right?
Ripple effect. Yeah.
A ripple effect, and some very wise women, often wise men also, have referred to this as, you know, the time of the great birthing, right? We are in the place and the time of the pangs associated with labor and birth, and the darkness that we feel is the darkness of the birth canal, right? And we have this, we're coming through these very tight, constricted moments in order to be born into, you know, a new world, a Pachacuti, right? So there are many prophecies, right, that relate to this. You know, we talk of, gosh, and I'm going to unfortunately not have them all on the tip of my tongue, right? But there is, you know, the Hopi prophecies of coming into this place where humans have to make a choice, right, between going down the dark path and moving forward through the transition. You know, do we view this time as the hole or the portal, right? Are we willing to engage with the darkness? And that means, you know, integrating all of the shadow parts of ourself, both on an individual level and on a collective level. Are we willing to engage? And so far we haven't been, in this country anyway. Are we willing to engage in the kind of reconciliation that is necessary, where we own our sins? We own our sin of racism, of endemic racism, right, upon which this country was founded. We own our sins of crass materialism. We own our sins of raping of the mother. We acknowledge and own and repent and take a different path, right? So there's this integrating of the dark side, where first we have to recognize it
And acknowledge it.
and acknowledge it.
Take responsibility for it.
Take responsibility for it, and stop playing the victim, that it's somebody else's fault that we got here, right? So that's what the Pachacuti is about. And part of the Pachacuti, in Don Oscar's system, he has a shamanic path that is called the Pachacuti Mesa tradition of cross-cultural or universal shamanism. And it is about right relationship, coming into right relationship through this re-acknowledgement and remembering, and through the intentional use of ritual to slow ourselves down, acknowledge and remind ourselves about the need to consecrate our space and our lives, and the ability to come into community together, which of course communities happen to cohere most completely when there is a ritual foundation for community, right? And in our
Right.
society, we don't have a whole lot of ritual. But the Pachacuti involves, this this recognition that we have to change our consciousness first, right?
As
And that,
individuals before we can do it collectively.
right,
Yeah.
and that all that will follow.
And it's interesting, the same lessons as an individual can apply to our society as a whole, too. I mean, it's that journey over and over again.
The
So,
within and the without, right? Those
oh,
ancient
yeah.
mystery schools that say it's all the same.
I call it the big rethink, the big paradigm
Mhm.
shift.
Mhm.
And it's interesting how many people have been articulating this as well, the deep time, the deep history, the new story for the universe. There's so many ways of, it just seems to be bubbling up all over that we're taking account of ourselves and telling ourselves a new story, calling for that new story. But it's really an old story. And what I'm interested in as a prophecy, so it implies that our arc is inevitable, that we are on the path that has been allotted, that it is the natural growth pattern for us. So I don't feel like we're so off base. I guess we're just going through the journey. And the road has been rocky, as it must be, for us to get through the eye of the needle and onto the other side. I guess those are the forces and the pressures that come to bear on us to wake us up and to push us along, right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
but a difficult birth, oh my. So, I want to ask Chris Van Poel
Sure.
her thoughts. You were mentioned earlier, Chris. So, and I want to take the really wonderful comments. You mentioned there were many in the chat room. Why don't you put on your mic one by one and we'll hear directly? And that's Paul's.
Okay, I'm
That
gonna
was wonderful. Thank you so much. My students read several of your articles, and it was really a treat to hear about your own experience in Florida that you had. So that was wonderful.
Thanks.
One of my grad students is here today, and he has a question about communitas, about the Turner's Edith's work. So would it be okay if I ask Cam to ask that question, Laura and Paul?
Sure.
Oh my
Of
gosh,
course.
yes. Cam always has such interesting questions and provocative.
Yeah, he already came to Mizzou knowing quite a bit about the Turners, so he has his perspective on that as well. I thought he was here a second ago.
I am here, if you guys can hear me.
Yeah,
You're
we can hear
hiding.
you. We're just looking for you
All
and
right.
so we can spotlight you. Yeah, there you are.
I was only going to ask, one of the things that I realized about Edith Turner's concepts on the communitas is that they're talking about shared liminality.
Mhm.
And there's an entire philosophical argument being made here that I think a lot of people miss, all right? That people focus for the most part on what Victor Turner talked about as far as liminality is concerned, but they miss Edith Turner's arguments, granted with Victor, that were when she expanded on later, regarding pilgrimage or regarding the aspects of liminality from a group setting, right? Where you have not just an entire community moving in the aspects of liminality, but maybe entire societies moving in that direction, where they all have to deal with a shared amount of change. All right. What do you feel about that as far as what we're talking about? Because I think that this is something that my personal opinion, a lot of people miss. As I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying a lot of people miss on this particular subject that is so crucial when we're talking about massive amounts of change in groups overall. So I'll leave it to you.
And can you define luminality in that context as well and give us some background?
Liminality is the aspect of going through an in-between stage between where you're moving from point A to point B, and that area, that point in between that people refer to as a time of change that people go through in their lives. We can also refer to it as the location where between like sea and shore, or mountain and sky, the locations that we see that we normally associate where the magic occurs, those
Gotcha.
in between locations.
Liminality.
Right?
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
liminality.
Okay.
Okay, Josh, I'm reading your question too. Yeah, I first of all, I have to say that I am not as familiar with Edith's take on communitas and liminality as I am with Victor's. Most of my interactions with her were in conversation about the ontological issues that were brought up with her own experiences of the spirit world, and how much I resonated with her from my own experiences. So I'm not quite sure that I have enough of a foundation in the differences between what Victor had to say and what Edith re-articulated later to be able to be very intelligent in my response. If you're asking, so maybe just say one or two more things so that I can try and catch the thread.
What did Victor say about it?
Well, he was talking specifically about rites of passage, specifically for individuals, right? And where I come to find that Edith kind of expanded on that aspect was the aspect of talking about people in pilgrimage when they were going from, like, people taking pilgrimages to Rome, or people taking pilgrimages to various different locations, right? Well, you build a community that seems to work with it, are all moving in the same direction in communitas with each other, all right? And they have this shared liminalities that are going on. And there seems to be almost like a shared, dare I say, mythical or magical state that these groups of individuals are working together, right? And it's one of the first times I've ever read someone talk about the aspect, of a group as a whole moving in a position of a liminal state. You understand where I'm going with this?
Yeah. Okay.
We're a whole group, all right? Not just one person going through it, a whole chunk of people going through it at the same time. And they're sharing this interconnective aspect of liminality as they're going, okay?
Right.
And you could make an argument that whole societies, perhaps, can be moving in that same type of way, where we are having a shared situation where, from a political standpoint of view, or from a some of the standpoint of views you brought up as far as dealing with environmental issues and whatever else, or the changes that groups go through, all right, over long periods of time, all right, and eventually have to come together, all right, and then have moving towards the end result. You understand where I'm going with this now?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I think so I think that's where the power of ritual comes in, right? Obviously, and that's something that Turner's talked about. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love Oscar Miguel Quesada's work so much, because, you know, his, first of all, we live in a very modern world where there's a lot of choice, and there, you know, most of us, in terms of the choices that we have, whether it's choices about spirituality, you know, we can take down from the bookshelf a little bit of paganism and a little bit of, you know, Catholicism and a little bit of crystal gazing, and we can wrap them all up and create this kind of,
we have the smorgasbord of
fluid smorgasbord option, right? Which is antithetical to what smaller scale societies historically did, and what we did until about the middle of the last century, where, you know, we were much more, we cohered around family, around village, around community, around farm town, around religion, around synagogue, around civic
a single
association.
worldview.
Yeah, we had much more of a single worldview. We are much more, in the modern world, diversity is lifted up. Diversity is not necessarily a good thing, right? Because diversity, one of the things it does is it isolates. When we become more diverse, what do we tend to do? We become turtles, right? We tend to not engage with people whose opinions are different than our own. And what you're talking about is a call to shared community, which which occurs in the context of ritual performance, I believe. And that's one of the reasons that I love what Oscar does with the Pachacuti Mesa tradition, is because it's all built around people coming together in community and engaging in ritual acts together. And
something magical happens.
Yes.
It's almost as though there's a field shift around you. And I think that principle applies across the board, and we find very interesting commonalities and mind melds that go on, even though we're scattered across the globe. When you
Yes.
come together at the same time in ritual, it's
Yes.
almost as though a pot is stirred and a portal is opened, and there's
Yes.
a field shift that happens. It's
Yes.
really, really, this egregore that happens.
Yes, and it can happen on Zoom. I mean,
Yes,
COVID
because
has been right.
you're applying
Yeah.
some other state, and that
Yes.
state has different rules of time and space.
Yes.
And geography
Yes.
is not a barrier. Geographical
if-
distance, it flows through something like that.
That's been the,
There's another, go ahead.
I was going to say, that's been the grand experiment of working with Dr. Goodman's work and putting it on Zoom and seeing what's going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
What's going to happen is that people are going to have experiences, and that the community will be developed, and that we can
Yes.
have shared
Shared.
experiences, whether we're sitting in a kiva in New Mexico or whether we've got people from Switzerland, Europe, Israel, wherever. I mean, we're
Egypt,
all-
everywhere.
wherever.
And we've also talked with hands-on healers to explore that, because we're asking, how is it that you can work and a patient far distant who's not in the room with you will feel the effect? So that effect is engaged as well, this spooky effect at a distance, as Einstein wanted to call it. It is so interesting. Ritual engages on that level.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's what we need more of, right?
Yeah.
In order to be able to come into a place of society-wide communitas, liminality, transformation. We need to be able to lift up the ritual, lift up the shared spaces.
And when Dean Radden was on from IONS, he was talking about an experiment with this and moments where the entire world comes together with one event, or a sports stadium comes together looking at one event. You can actually see the blip on random number generator if you're going to do that experiment. So
Heart
it's
math,
physical.
right?
It has a physical effect as well.
Yep.
And go ahead.
Well, I was just going to interject. For those of you that are less familiar with Victor and Edith Turner, we do have an article on our website. Edith Turner, I spoke to her just prior to her passing, unfortunately that I got to speak to her to get her permission. But she wrote an article called
We had an interview scheduled, and then she was gone.
The Reality of Spirits, a Taboo, a Permitted Field of Study. And it really kind of gives a great overview of the work and the history of what her and her husband did. It's a great introduction for those of us that are less familiar.
We also have all her books on our bookshelf.
And I posted it in the chat room for people to be able to click on. Go back
so
to
a
it.
ready thing. Another phenomenon that's very interesting is the black sheep effect, I think. And, we've asked our community, how many of you feel like the black sheep of your family? Or you feel, and we hear this a lot, the angst of not fitting like I belong here. And I think that we're so out of sync with modern society. Modern society has gone over here, and we're somehow anchored in these old values and traditions and mindset. And so it's interesting. It's very interesting to try, this need to, maybe we're here to help build bridges. Maybe that's part of our role. Maybe, let's get humanity help back on track. Or maybe we're kernels popping, has been described early on for this awakening. I mean, how do you understand this seeking? So many of us are seeking, and it seems to be a life mission. Are you awoke? Are you awoke?
Right.
Your thoughts, all of you, on that?
I have one thought, and then I'd love to hear other people's thoughts. I struggle with this a lot, in my work as an interfaith leader and building capacity among my students for building bridges across religious difference, what you just mentioned, because often religion and spiritual sort of parts of our identities are those, first of all, that provide in some respects the space to either blow us apart or to bring us together, right? I mean, it can be sort of following the spiritual and the religious can be a vehicle to transformation. And obviously all of the topics that we're talking about fall broadly under the domain of religion and spirituality, right? And there is such a there is such a what is it? Centrifugal, right? Centripetal is what comes in. Centrifugal is what goes out, right? We are in this world spinning moment in which the centrifugal forces are blowing everything apart. And there is this tendency, I feel it myself too, to shut off those voices that I do not agree with, that cannot be part of my consciousness, the lower vibrations, right? Of, you know, the pieces that are dragging me down, right? And the the debate I have with myself is wow, is there any possible way forward if I'm not bringing in and bringing along and working with my own discomfort such that I can build bridges across those apparent chasms and continue to engage in conversation with people that I just feel are lost, right? Can I, and I feel like that is part of the work of this time, is to not only, you know, find the balance for ourselves, but in terms of, you know, this idea of right relationship,
With
we need
all
to
of us.
recognize with all of us, the without is the same as the within. And so what are my responsibilities to continue to engage in compassionate and open and appreciative and respectful dialogue with people for whom, you know, with whom I'd really rather not ever come into contact.
Right.
But I
You know, and
appreciate
that's
that you also
hard.
open that kind of dialogue on your campus with the students, interfaith, interspirituality. Tell us a
Right.
little bit about those efforts and how you call it speed faithing, similar to speed dating. I thought that was a wonderful structure to follow. Tell us about that at least.
I should say thank you, Cam and Chris, because we have them just sitting here listening in.
They probably have more to say.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
They'll work for you guys.
I guess just really briefly, my campus is a very homogenous campus. It's a very Mormon dominated campus. 70% of our students are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? And for the students who are not members of that faith, it can feel very isolating and very marginalizing. And but more than that, like, religion is sort of the elephant in the room. Spirituality is the elephant in the room. It's what we don't talk about, and yet what everyone wants to talk about. And I know this through some campus-based research that I did. So speed faithing provides a space in which students can come together in structured dialogue with conversation partners and address questions that wouldn't normally come up in ordinary conversation, like, you know, what is your religious tradition, and what values do you hold, why is it precious to you, and what would you like me to know about how people stereotype and make assumptions about your religion, and what else would you like me to know, right? It's this structured dialogue that happens speed dating, like, you know, in 1 to 2 minute segments. And always after this, students feel like, wow, I feel like I have a lot more in common with people that I never would have engaged in dialogue around important themes before, because the ice has been broken, and we
Gone
laid some
beyond the
ground
labels.
rules. Yeah, we've gone beyond we've laid some ground rules. You know, we're not debating who's right and wrong. I'm approaching this conversation, this snippet of a conversation, as a listener. I want to learn something from you. I want to be a curious learner. And inevitably, it opens space for greater relationship and greater dialogue. It is the first of many sort of tools in the toolbox for building interfaith cooperation, and probably the easiest of the tools, because it's something that everybody likes to do, is talk about themselves. But it has been an important piece to what I was just mentioning a moment ago to Trash, is that this idea of, you know, how do we begin to rebuild, intentionally engage with people who are different than we are, against the entropy of just living in our turtle shells in the modern world. And in that intentional engagement, can we find, there's a lot of things that we will never agree on, but can we find some things that we do agree on, like some shared values of compassion, of service, of social justice, of many kinds of shared values? Can we engage at that level and build relationship with one another such that maybe we can begin to see ourselves as a community working together for a common good, which is something that we've lost largely in modern society, and especially in the last 4 years or 5 years.
Politically, yeah.
So many forces that are coming to bear to push us away from that very thing. We saw an interview with Tristan Harris of the Society for Humane Technology, and he was describing how, Facebook and other corporate giants
social media companies
are trying to engage us, and they look at the longer posts and they give those priority. The longer posts are more the argumentative, the ones that are trying to convince you of something, and it seems like just for their shareholders' benefit, we are being torqued in a way to be very divisive, argumentative, not trusting one another, and splitting us apart.
The algorithms look for the extremes in their software, so
and
that's
push
what
that into our brains.
Right.
Yeah. And so it's so interesting. I came across this just trying to battle my way into talk radio and say, no, I don't want to be the daytime drive time host. Yes, listen to me. This is what you need to believe, and I'm going to argue you, and I'm going to drill this into your brain. The patriarchal approach. Mine was more, I need to ask questions and engage. I need to have an open, not a gaping mind. I need to go to those places where I can ask the far reaches. The liminal state, as you were talking about, Cam, I found too the most interesting, where the shore meets the ocean. That's where change happens. That's where it's frothed up. That's where we find the anomalies that are really, if you look at them, raising a red flag going, hey, look at me. Look at this. This is where the world view needs to expand, and we need to accommodate this.
Sure.
Yeah, come on back into the conversation.
I'm only going to say this, and I know people are going to disagree with me. That's fine, but in my personal opinion, the liminality of group, the liminality of the social, all right, not the individual, but the social, is the very definition of the divine feminine.
The divine feminine.
Oh, okay.
That's
Talk a little bit more on that.
I'm
trying to. The liminality of the social is the divine feminine. That's what you just said. How do you mean?
Amen.
The very aspect of saying that building the spiritual amongst the group as a whole. All right, not on the individual level liminality aspects of like that. I'm talking about building that communitas in the group as a whole. In my personal opinion, is a manifestation of the divine feminine. Now, people may disagree with me, but I think that the roles
we're loving it.
The roles between men and women are in some ways distinct, in the aspect that men think more Cartesian, in the aspect maybe perhaps men think more in the aspect of, on the individual level, the rites of passage being to preserve all those things that the divine masculine is on that individual, where the divine feminine is on the social, where we're attempting to control, to work with the group. All right.
But I would be careful.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to add, I would be careful with I'm sure you are aware of this, but I wanted to just make sure that the rest of the listeners are aware of that. When we're talking about the divine feminine and the divine masculine, we're not talking necessarily about an embodied female and an embodied male, right? Because a human male can be very in tune with the divine feminine, and a human female can be very in tune with the divine masculine. But I love that idea about, that is one of the things that is I think so at the heart of feminist and feminine spirituality is relationality, right? It's relational.
Community.
It's relationship with self. It's relationship with community. It's relationship with the environment. It's relationship. So this idea of the relationality at the community level as being sort of an inherent
how do you
piece.
get babies to survive? How do you get babies to survive long term from an evolutionary point of view, unless you're not working with a community?
Exactly.
You have to build those.
Exactly.
You know what I'm talking about.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's that part of that what I'm referring to. But anyway, I'm gonna shut
Look
up. And
at
thanks
look
so
at
much for your time.
biological imperatives and how women are gifted with eyes in the back of our head, with sensing what's going on, with multitasking to keep the family going, the family group to engage as on a community level. And they say men are out there to hunt, to have this extreme focus and exclude everything else so they can get the job done and go in those dangerous territories where all their senses need to be on alert, right? So there's biological imperatives as well that perhaps come into play here on some level.
There's a yin yang here is what I'm saying. That there's a connection between
Two
men
parts
and women
with
that
two
would
different skill
complement each other.
sets make a whole.
Right.
Yeah.
I just am
Interesting
noticing the
insight.
questions, and I want to make sure that some of the people
Please,
who
let's
are
go. Let's go for it.
Yeah. So
Thank you, Cam.
Thank you, Cam. So I wanted, Lori, yes, I am in Utah, and I am in the heart of Mormon country. And so you're here in Utah too. We should talk at some point. Yes, being non-Mormon in a Mormon state is in fact very, very interesting. Let's see. So question. So
It's
many
very nice when
non-Peruvian-
guests do their own chat. Check. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Thank
love
you.
that. I think I've covered some of the questions earlier. I didn't see, maybe, I don't know who Reshma is, but maybe you can ask your question in a minute. Let's see.
Can we
What
find
else?
her to ask the question?
Her question was fairly long. I can't.
Well,
and
let's get
she can
on,
raise her
jump
hand.
on,
She can raise her
so
hand,
Paul
Reshma,
can
and
see
ask
you,
verbally.
and he can
Yeah,
spotlight you and turn on your mic. That's the
Yeah.
easiest way.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then Jamie was saying, so many non-Peruvians are now teaching shamanic practices. I think her question is, what's your thoughts about? Is
Yeah.
this positive, or is this even appropriate? What's going on with this whole thing of shamanism being adopted into Western culture?
I have some things to say on that, but I'll hold until Reshma gets a chance to ask her question.
Hello.
Okay. There she. Yeah, her mic
Hi.
is her turn. There she is.
We
Thank you for
found you.
hearing. Yeah, thank you for hearing my question. It's quite personal, so I wasn't sure if it was a good place to talk about it, but I know you're limited for time, so I'll be quick. Just in my own experience, I was wondering if you've come across women shamans who are presented with, I guess, in their dream work and astral traveling, not intentionally, but they come to them, or they're brought to these places where they are they are confronted with heavier entities that are, they have no idea. I have no idea why they're being presented to me, but I feel that kind of like an exorcist sometimes, in the sense that, I say a prayer, and it can be a bit scary, because a lot of them, although they approach as humans, they all actually end up, when I see them after that, they appear as alien entities.
What is your practice? What is your spiritual practice that you're engaging in?
Oh, just a bit of everything: priestess work, a bit of shamanic dance, and just dance mostly, to be honest, but just a natural dreamer, to be honest. And since I was 20, I've been thrust out of my body to all sorts of dimensions and seen all sorts of things completely unavoidable. I just couldn't, and I tried to get out of them, and I had to just learn, to be honest, by myself, how to get out of these situations. But luckily, it's, as I've become more grounded, it's happening less often. But it does still happen sometimes, where these entities, it's almost like I feel like either I'm being brought to them, or they're being brought to me. Have you come across many female shamans that have similar stories?
Well, yeah. I mean, in my work in Peru, the two women that I work the most with, who now travel extensively in the United States, and that goes to this next question that I want to make sure we talk about appropriation, etc. But as I mentioned earlier, shamanic practice in Peru really is about healing people of sorcery, right? I mean, traditionally, it's about engaging with some of those really dark energies, and so a lot of like I was just noticing in the written version of your question, this sense about feeling, in parts of your body, right? The presence. And that's one of the things that Isabel talked about a lot, is just how much suffering is involved when you do this work. It is not fun. It is not easy. And sometimes it would be really helpful. I mean, it would be very, a common denominator of shamanic healers that I'm familiar with and have read about is this sense of being called into the vocation and kicking and screaming, not wanting to go there because it sucks, because the way that you feel is sometimes disembodied, is sometimes alienated, is sometimes not in tune with, you know, with what you thought would be normal. I mean, it's out of control. It's painful to experience viscerally to experience the pain that a patient is struggling with, whether it is emotional or soul-based or spiritual or psychic or physical or all of the above. It's not fun, right? And I think that's a very common theme, especially in traditional shamanism. I mean, there's a lot of shamanism that has been kind of rewrapped in what I would call a new age package, right? That's much more about spiritual awakening, and it's very important. And I'm definitely I'm part of that whole conversation. But in traditional terms, shamanism has been about you know, viscerally engaging with the suffering of another, whether it's at the level of astral travel or it's at the level of feeling possessed by those dark energies, and being able to sit in the darkness with those energies and befriend them, listen to the message, and wish them well on their way, right? That's a part of it. So I guess the short answer is yes, I have. And I'm grateful that not so much on a personal level, because I myself I do not feel as much a practitioner. I do not feel the calling as much as the people that I've spent so much time studying with. And I'm grateful for that, because the moments in my life where I have felt the transformations have been very uncomfortable.
So find a good mentor if you're feeling the call.
I was thinking
right?
that as
Right.
well. Yeah.
Exactly.
This is not something to undertake alone.
Yeah. Rishma, does that help? Does that give you some insight?
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice to hear of just different. I haven't spoken about it a lot, so.
Well,
It's hard to talk about this in polite
yeah,
society, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
But thank you for your question.
And good luck to you. Keep us
Yeah.
posted. Yeah.
Thanks.
So,
Yeah, you're doing good work.
Yeah.
yeah.
And do you want to jump to that other question about?
Yeah, sure. So Jamie Zoe Givens asked, so many non-Peruvians are now teaching. Or maybe, do you want to ask your question, Jamie, rather than me reading it?
Yeah, Jamie, where are you? It's hard to find among. Oh, I see Jamie. Yeah. Okay.
You need to unmute, Jamie.
Hi.
Okay.
Thank you. It just seems like in the last 10 years, there's been this explosion of non-Peruvians teaching Peruvian shamanism. And I've been in classes with people, and all of a sudden I'm supposed to be building a mesa, and I'm feeling really uncomfortable because that's not what I actually signed up for, but that's an exercise in the group. And it just seems to me that several people they go and they take these classes, and then they're putting out their own classes and online work. And so I just wanted to know what, if the people that you work with have any thoughts, feelings, and beliefs about that.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and I would definitely, the people that I work with do, and I do too. This is a question I have wrestled with so much. It's part of the reason when I mentioned earlier that I never apprenticed to a shamanic healer. I was okay being in the role of the sickest one in the room, because it left the healer completely in charge, and I was the one, receiving both the counsel and the wisdom and the healing. And I was the disempowered one, right? Reclaiming power, and they were the one that maintained their power. and didn't ever really transfer it to me. And it's a dance, right? Since especially meeting Oscar many years later, I actually wrote about appropriation. One of the first articles I ever did was a little piece of an opinion piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education about what the role of the anthropologist ought to be, because sometimes we are the ones that introduce publics to these shamanic experts. And in the case of my friend Isabella and Olinda, they have become quite famous in their own right and are now touring around the US and Canada, in part because of the work that I did with them and the book that I wrote, which showcased their work. And there were a lot of other female healers that I worked with, the other 4 in Peru, who have never left their country and, haven't enjoyed the same notoriety, in part because I didn't happen to invite them to the same conference where they met a Belgian filmmaker who then did a documentary and sort of opened the doors, right, for them. So there's a lot of sort of ethical dilemma and moral dilemma, right, that I as an anthropologist have struggled with. But one of the things also that I am aware of is that we are in urgent times, right? We are in a place and a time when, as my friend Oscar says, we are all indigenous to the planet.
Right.
We are all indigenous to the planet.
Yeah.
And I think that the key is to bring forward the wisdoms without appropriating the particular practices.
Yeah.
Without representing ourselves as something that we're not. I don't think that 4 weekends in a 4-weekend workshops mean that I ought to be hanging out a shingle and saying I'm practicing shaman. I'm really not okay with that.
Yeah.
But I think on the other hand, this idea of there is incredible wisdom in this idea of sacred reciprocity with the non-human world that is at the foundation of pretty much all shamanic paths that I know of, and re-ritualizing and engaging in experiences that, as Cam was saying a minute ago, might create a sense of communitas and liminality in larger groups is really important. But can I do that in a way that respects the tradition and the authority rather than co-opting it, right? That's the trick. And not represent myself as something that I'm not. And at the same time, recognizing that, yeah, I am indigenous to the planet, and this is important, an important way of walking in the world that needs space for people to reflect and engage with.
And these pathways to open and engage this covenant with this other realm, with the spirits, is indigenous to us, is our birthright. Mm-hmm. These states and trances are built into our DNA, must be found and expressed in our life journey somehow. So many avenues to do that. I do appreciate our own founder, Felicitas Goodman, for taking the common elements among the world's rituals for calling the spirits and finding out what are the essential steps and creating a formula then that doesn't step on
removing the cultural overlays,
toes, but still allows through the body and the body, brain, mind, and its response to the cues in the ritual to reach that state. Mm-hmm. So kind of neutralized it, because my first question to her is, who are my indigenous ancestors? Where do I find that? We got cut off at the knees in Europe through the vagaries of history. How do I get back to that without having to engage other cultures and their ways? Because I'm not that. Where do I find mine? And then you find you're all one family anyway. So again, this is all of our birthrights. So yeah. And
that's a great
happily,
question.
So many. Thank you, Jamie. And we have just a couple of minutes left. So what did we not cover that you would like to say here? I mean, you're such a easy and wonderful interview, and we've so enjoyed our visit with you. And thank you for all the great work that you've done, and the women's wisdom of spreading the wings and enclosing and embracing all of it.
I'd like to take a time in the future Bonnie, if you'd be willing to come back, and we'll go deeper into one avenue of your research, time when you've had, where we give you more than 2 days notice that you're going to be on, and you can prepare some things, because there's so much to your research. The more I kept looking up your name and looking at the articles and looking at the papers and looking at the research, this could go on for months, So we do
I'm
appreciate
sure
you.
she's got beautiful images to share as well.
That would be great.
And what is
Yeah,
the
I
snake
do.
behind you? You've got a plaque with a snake. Do you want to describe
Oh
that?
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So I'll
Oh,
go
and
a
you've
little
got an
closer.
artifact. What's the artifact next door? Oh, yeah.
The base.
Oh,
Yeah.
to the figure.
Both.
The figure,
That's
yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, gosh. This actually, I don't know much about. This was just from a friend of mine, actually from the same friend who painted this. This is a friend of mine who, I think one of the things we haven't talked about is the role of creativity, right? And how important
Yeah.
creativity is in this dance of reclaiming both our sense of connection with the holy, with the divine, and our way of walking forth that spirit into the world, right? How are we engaging with those creative juices? Is it through writing? In my world, it's often through writing. I'm a writer, and story catching and storytelling and story witnessing is part of my creative work. My friend EJ is an artist, and so she was inspired to do these dot paintings, and this was a dot painting of a serpent, which I would like to embody with the forces of the cosmic serpent, the mother goddess, the the anaconda of the Amazonian rainforest, who radiates energy that reharmonizes the world. But this is a dot painting that EJ did as a manifestation of her creativity that just really called to me.
Beautiful.
So.
Beautiful.
Yeah, wonderful. And what do you want to leave us with? We've covered a lot of ground. You've had such a fascinating life and career. So, to sum up.
Yeah. I guess maybe I would just leave us with the same lessons that were among the first lessons that I received in my work originally with the female healers that I worked with, that I sat with for many months back in the late 80s in Peru. And that would be that to walk through life is one thing, but to deeply engage and experience is another.
Mm-hmm.
And to be willing to open to the mystery and the magic of every moment, and the difficulty and the pain, as well as the joy and the delight, is part of our birthright. And that in coming into the fullness of deep acceptance and walking with that birthright in authenticity and vulnerability, in grace and with gratitude, we come a little closer to being able to move through this difficult time, and to look forward to a world in which we can delight more fully in all that we are.
Go ahead.
I was going to say a key takeaway from what you shared today as well is this whole concept of being a bridge builder and being able to reach across the aisle, whether it's politically, whether it's spiritually, whether it's whatever. This idea that this is the time that we have, because the fact is that we've gotten more and more isolated. It's going to take a little bit more effort than usual to come back, to be able to be reconnected. And so your project, I think, is very inspirational, and I'm so glad that you brought that up today, and hopefully all of us can find ways to participate in that kind of a bridge building.
Yeah. We are the change we've been waiting for, right?
And to tackle the big questions of life, start at an early age. You encourage your college students to do that. We need to tackle that. It's not an easy journey, but it's such a rewarding journey. And you also talked about reinventing yourself at various stages. And I think, we get to live in this lifetime, we get to live 5 or 6 or a dozen lifetimes packed into one. If you're willing to shed a few skins along the way and live anew to some new call to adventure. So I think it's a very exciting time in which we have to live. And I see that earlier societies had that collective mission of engaging with the covenant of the universe, engaging on a spiritual level, engaging. Where we lost that along the way, is an interesting question. But I wonder, do you ever see us getting back to that again? Is it going to be that science will deliver messages that will engage us on the spiritual level? Will it be that we have no other choice? Will it be that we're looking at slamming ourselves against the brick wall and we're here at 2 minutes to midnight and we realize it's now or never and we finally do? What do you think it's going to take? Is there any chance that we'll get back on track, or are we evolving into something completely new? Is it that the material and the spirit, which we've called for, we've got a body, we're in a physical planet, and yet we want to engage the spirit? Is it finally the answer that the only way forward is to engage both of those in some new fashion?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and a big question, and I think it's the very small sort of answer. I loved what you said a few minutes ago about the change happening at the shoreline, right? And in Quechua, again, the creator God, the mystery, the origin of the universe, the name for that presence is Huiracocha. Huira in Quechua means fat, quite literally. The foam is the fat, and Cocha is the sea. And the idea of this creative energy happening at the boundary of the stillness and the chaos, right? Of the order and the chaos. That's where creativity happens. And I think that we ought not to despair that we are in very chaotic times. In fact, we ought to celebrate that these moments of chaos provide the way forward into a new way of thinking and being. Because, if we use this analogy of walking through life with many veils, the creator, the creatrix, the mystery of the universe does not see us through any veils, but we see that originating mystery, that power, through so many veils. And I think the time of chaos and hurt and pain is a time when some of those veils are removed, whether it's a place of ill health, like when I'm in the hospital setting. People get into what's important and, talk about the stuff that matters when they are on the verge of death. It's interesting, isn't it? That the things that really matter. Right. So let's embrace this time at the shoreline as an opportunity to remove some of the veils that would keep us from engaging in these really important questions. And let's celebrate this time as a place of a portal that we can engage with in order to deeply heal ourselves.
I know personally that change for me happens most rapidly, most thoroughly when I'm backed up against the wall, and it is less painful to change than to stay the same. And then change happens, right? And so maybe collectively we're approaching that point. We're in that point,
right?
And so much energy is to be harnessed at that time as well, right? It's all the forces are brought to bear. Ride the wave, don't get crushed under the
beautiful message
under the board. Thank you so much. This has just been a delight. I appreciate you, Bonnie Glass-Coffin.